Hello everyone, hello. Welcome back for Unit 5 in Human Communication. So listening, this one's all about listening. Listening is a learned process of receiving and interpreting, recalling, evaluating, and responding to verbal and nonverbal messages. This is not hearing. Hearing is a whole different aspect. We'll talk about that. Listening is actually receiving, interpreting, being able to remember, evaluating this listening, and then responding through verbal and nonverbal channels. When we engage in the listening process, we're actually trying to process information. And we begin to engage in the listening process long before we engage in any recognizable verbal or nonverbal communication. Think about it. As infants, we are listening, and therefore begin to come up with our own forms of expression, our own language, our own meaning for the things people are saying around us. The listening process. So the listening is a process. It doesn't really have a defined start and finish. We're always listening. In fact, you as a college student are the most apt to be listening as of any adult out there. Like the communication process, listening has cognitive, behavioral, and relational elements. It doesn't unfold in a linear step-by-step process. Okay? Listening is the active process, again, of receiving, interpreting, and responding to verbal and nonverbal messages. The stages of the listening process are receiving, interpreting, recalling, evaluating, and responding. So let's start with receiving. Before we can engage in the other steps of the listening process, we must take in the stimuli through our senses. Any given communication encounter, we will often return to the receiving stage as we begin to process incoming feedback and new messages. This part of the listening process, it's more physiological than the other parts. We're actually utilizing more senses, which include cognitive and relational elements. We primarily take in information needed for listening through auditory and visual channels, right? Auditory, hearing, visual, with our eyes. As we're listening, think about it. We're looking at nonverbals. We're matching up nonverbals. Do they match up? We look at someone. We judge them. Can we trust them? Is the information accurate? All through visual and the auditory process. We don't think about the visual cues often. But again, when we see somebody's face, while we're listening to them speak, it allows us to take in the verbal clues from the facial expressions and the eye contact. The fact that these visual cues are missing in email, text, and phone interactions, that presents difficulty in reading for contextual clues and or assigning meaning, because we're only being able to use certain auditory channels, right? Or, in the case of email and text and phone, we're having to rely on visuals. So if you think about it, a phone conversation without video, it's just auditory. We've got mediated communication like email and text. Those are just visual. So we're missing part of the information. And that's why I think many times we have confusion in those channels, because we can't convey emotion very clearly. These perceptual filters play a role in listening. Our auditory and our visual channels can't possibly comprehend and grab everything about a moment. Some of the stimuli never make it through and are filtered into our subconsciousness. Others are filtered into various levels of consciousness depending on their saliency. Now, if you remember, saliency is the degree to which something attracts our attention within some sort of context. We generally find things salient that are visually and auditory or auditorily stimulating, right? We're more apt to remember them if that's the case. You think about how much easier it is to listen to a lecture on a subject that you find interesting versus a subject you find boring, right? It's a perfect example. When we think about receiving messages, we have to consider, again, noise. We talked a little bit about noise before. I've mentioned it. Noise interferes mainly with our hearing. And it's a physical process of receiving stimuli. And then it's, with noise, we're not getting the full message because something's distracting us. A moment ago, I was just distracted as I was starting to explain this by my dog, who turned around in the bed and grunted. She's 10 years old. She's getting older, so she was having difficulty making herself comfortable. It created noise, and it caused me to pause for a second in the middle of my thought. So that's a perfect example of how noise can affect our ability to listen. Now, when we think about hearing, that's the cognitive act of hearing sounds. It's bouncing off our eardrums, right? That's not the same thing as listening. So keep that in mind. I keep reiterating that. I'm trying to get that point across because there'll be questions about that within our midterm and final. Environmental noise, such as other people talking, the sound of traffic, music, my dog grunting, right, a moment ago, interfere with the psychological aspects of hearing, or even, in my case, thinking, trying to get the idea across. Psychological noise is like stress and anger, or hunger. I mentioned that one before as well, especially those that take my public speaking class, about little things you can do to help yourself pay more attention in class, and things you can do to help you be able to deliver messages more effectively. Being hungry is one of those things that interfere with our ability to do something well. Same thing with stress or anger. If we have anger, we generally aren't very good at listening. It's a common trait throughout humanity. When we're angry, we don't care to listen. We can enhance our ability to receive by, in turn, listening and minimizing noise. So let's go to the next stage. During the interpretive stage of listening, we combine the visual and auditory information that we've received, and we attempt to make meaning out of that information. We use schemata to do that. The interpreting stage engages in cognitive and relational processing, meaning our past experiences come into play, right? Also, our cognitive state, how awake we are, how alert we are, and how ready to receive we are. We take in the informational, contextual, and relational cues, and we try to connect them in meaningful ways based off of our previous experience. It's in the interpreting stage that we begin to understand the stimuli around us, right? We then think about the speaker's ideas, his tone, his demeanor, maybe even his dress, right? We go into the trust factor. We start weeding it out. Can we trust it? Is this also something we've previously understood? Is this something we've talked about or heard talked about? And then we think back through our Rolodex of memories and think about how we can correlate that to previous learning. And through that process of comparing new information with old information, we update and revise the schemata if we find the new information relevant and credible, right? Interpreting. If we're having difficulty interpreting the information meaning we don't have a previous experience or information that we've got in our memory bank through our existing schemata, we can't really make good sense of it. And therefore, it's difficult to transfer that information into our long-term memory and recall it later on. In situations where understanding the information we receive isn't important or isn't a goal, this stage of interpreting is pretty short-lived, maybe even skipped over altogether, especially if the information aligns with previous schemata, right? Previous experience. To have something move to our long-term memory, it either requires repetition and then recall, and we can't do that if we don't understand it. Speaking of recall is just the ability for us to take the information that we learned, right, in our brain, we heard, we received it, and we stored it away. Then we grab it with recall. And recalling information is dependent on physiological limits of how our memory works. Overall, our memories are doomed to be fallible. Here's why I want you not to stop beating yourself up, especially in your college classes. We forget about half of what we hear immediately after hearing it. We can recall 35% in about 8 hours, and we recall 20% after about 24 hours. Our memory consists of multiple storage units, multiple RAMs inside our head, right? Which include sensory storage, short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory. That's how our brain works. There you see the diagram of literally taking in information and how it goes to the brain. In the recall situation, it's difficult because if we're hungry, if we're tired, we're not going to be able to recall information as quickly or readily. Our sensory storage is very large in capacity, but limited in amounts of length of storage. We can hold large amounts of unsorted visual information, but only for about 1/10 of a second. So literally really quick. By comparison, we can hold large amounts of unsorted auditory information for up to 4 seconds. This initial memory storage unit doesn't provide much use for our study of communication. It's hard to try to study that, but these large chunks of data are usually used for reactionary and instinctual ways. As the stimuli are organized and interpreted, they make their way to the short-term memory, where they either expire because we can't remember everything, right? Therefore, they're forgotten, or they're transferred into our long-term memory. Short-term memory is a mental storage capacity that can retain stimuli for 20 seconds to about 1 minute. Long-term memory is the storage capacity in which this short-term memory basically takes that stimuli, transfers it if it's connected to an existing schemata, in which the information can be stored indefinitely. Now, when I say connected to an existing schemata, this goes back to the idea of we have to have understood something and applied it to previous learning. Or working memory is temporarily accessed memory storage space that's activated during the times of high cognitive demand, meaning when we're thinking about something and relating it to previous memories, we're utilizing that working memory. We can temporarily store information and process it and use that same information all at the same time. It's so drastically different than our typical memory function. So it's kind of what we call working memory. Working memory it's almost really like RAM in a computer, meaning it's being utilized for processes and we're doing it at real time. People with good working memories can keep recent information in mind and process it and apply it later on to other information that they may receive. When we think about recall is an important part of the listening process. There's not a great correlation between being good at recalling information and being a good listener. Some people have excellent memories and recall abilities. I am blessed with excellent recall ability. But as I age, it's starting to wane just a touch. I'm the guy that can tell you the story 3 times and the story's still the same, right? Because I remember it. I lived it. I also can do that in these classes, talking about different pieces of information within my area of expertise, communication. Recall is an important part of the listening process because it's most often used to access the listening abilities, effectiveness of us being able to remember something. When we think about evaluating, that's our next step. When we evaluate something, we're judging it on terms of credibility, completeness, and worth. Meaning, is it something I think I'm going to need? In terms of credibility, we try to determine how much we believe the speaker's statements are true, right? Correct. In terms of completeness, we're trying to read between the lines, evaluate the message in relation to what we know about the topic or the situation being discussed. We evaluate the worth of a message by making a judgment, a value judgment, right? We think about, is this valuable to me? Is this good or bad? Right or wrong? Desirable or undesirable? All gets weighed into that step, this evaluating step. All of these aspects of evaluating require critical thinking skills, and we weren't born with those, believe it or not. We develop those over time through using our own personal and intellectual development. Meaning we got better at school as we were immersed in school. When you think about, and this just a side note from me, but when I think about studying communication, it's a great way to build critical thinking skills because you learn how much more about the taken for granted sections of communication and how it all works, which gives you the tools to analyze and critique messages, senders, and context in a more effective manner, meaning ultimately it can help you remember more information. Then there's the responding step. Responding means sending verbal or nonverbal messages that indicate attentiveness, understanding. When we think about students in class, maybe that nod I get from you, or that moment of right? When we think about, that's an important part of the whole of listening and retaining information. Because a good teacher needs to see that we're doing our job, right? We need to see that. Later on, we'll learn more about the specifics of encoding and decoding of verbal and nonverbal cues. But at this point, we know from our experience some signs that indicate whether somebody's paying attention or not, right? As a teacher, if I see closed off body language, which we'll talk more about later, then I know that they may or may not be listening. I can't say 100% they're not listening because maybe they're a little frustrated, not necessarily with me. Maybe there was a relational issue with someone they love before class, right? And it affects their ability to receive information and retain information and therefore respond. We send back the verbal feedback. Again, I talked about this a little bit on the back channel cues. The or oh, okay, I understand, right? Nonverbal cues, direct eye contact, head nods, leaning forward. Looking for that leaning forward. People send cues intentionally and unintentionally, for that matter, right? Especially if they're not listening. If a person's looking away, fidgeting, texting, turned away, I can see those and know that those responses aren't what I'm looking for. So how should we respond in the responding phase? Paraphrasing is a beautiful way to respond to someone. That way you can make sure you're getting an understanding of what was communicated. In a paraphrase, you're rephrasing the message in your own words. And you might lead off with a statement like, what I heard you say was, or I think you're saying, it seems like you're saying, or if I'm understanding this correctly, you said, and then you rephrase it in your own words what they said. Another great tool you can use, asking clarifying questions to get more information. You can pair that with the paraphrase and keep the conversation going and make sure you truly understand something. Paraphrasing will be on the test. The importance of listening. Now that we're getting an understanding of how listening works and how it provides the foundation of all the things we need, especially as college students, right? As we're trying to learn, increase our knowledge, then we really need to explore why we listen. What are our reasons for listening, right? And there are generally when I think about the idea of listening, most of the time it's about achieving a communicational goal, which is either physical, instrumental, relational, or even an identifying role. And then we kind of we covered that a bit earlier in class. We kind of talked about the reasons why we do things, why we communicate, right? Listening's no different. Listening's part of communication, and therefore we have our reasons that we must listen. If you think about it, one of the biggest places we do listen is, again, academic. But we also listen in professional roles, and even in our personal relationships. At least we better listen, because if we don't listen, we're going to miss out, and that personal relationship might suffer, right? In terms of academics, poor listening skills were shown to contribute significantly to failure in a person's first year of college. In general, students with higher scores for listening ability have greater academic achievement. Interpersonal communication skills, including listening, are highly sought after by potential employers. And we talked a little bit about personal, right? Sorry, I think I copied the same one twice. Sorry, I'll get that cleared out. The importance of listening. In our personal lives and our relationships, it's ultra important as well. We never think about that actively. Many times we don't think about it actively. But don't underestimate the power of listening. It makes people feel better. It opens up our perceptual fields. We learn more information about people, about relationships, about life in general. Empathetic listening is a great way to help us expand our self and social awareness, because we learn from other people's experiences. We help create emotional support by empathetic listening, right? We're listening to them. They're telling us their problems. They're telling us their concerns. And it helps create validation in times of conflict. It helps us manage the common stressors of relationships. You're going to learn more about this later. Relationships are always in a status. They're either growing, very briefly stagnant, or they're being deconstructed, done away with. If we don't listen, our relationships will go away, because people will realize we're not paying attention. We're only in it for us. The main purposes of listening: to focus on messages sent by other people or noises coming from our surroundings, to better understand other people's communication, to critically evaluate other people's messages, to monitor nonverbal signals, to indicate we are listening or paying attention, to empathize with others and show that we care for them. That's relational maintenance. We'll talk more about that in relationship communication. And to engage in negotiation, dialogue, or other exchanges that result in a shared understanding or an agreement on an issue or information. Main types of listening we'll discuss are discriminative, informational, critical, and empathetic. When we think about listening, sometimes we're listening for a reason. I mean, we're always listening for a reason, but we can know the reason pretty quick. So when we think about discriminative listening, it's focused on listening to psychological things, situations. It's listening for specific stimuli. For example, if I'm listening in a way that I'm fearful, like say I'm walking across the yard or walking my dogs in the neighborhood, I do this every night, and it's dark. I may be listening closer, discriminative listening, for any danger that might lurk in the night that I can't see with my little headlamp on as I'm walking my dogs. Informational listening is with a purpose of comprehending and retaining information. We're very much doing that here at school, right? It's not evaluative, and it's common in teaching and learning context, meaning where we're at right now. Or we might be informational listening if someone gives us directions on how to get somewhere, or a certain way we might need to dress for a certain party that we're going to. We also use informational listening when we listen to news reports, our voicemails on our phone, and even briefings at work, right? Getting us back up to speed, especially if we've been on vacation. Critical listening is, again, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but the goal of analyzing and evaluating message based on the verbal presentation, and any nonverbals as well, right? It's up to us in that time to either accept it, reject it, or withhold judgment and seek more information. Otherwise, we won't create a memory. Now, sometimes in this step, in critical listening, sometimes we let our fallacies, our own previous perceptions, get in the way of a message. Or sometimes we have faulty logic, meaning we believe a certain way because we've been told to believe a certain way, and then all of a sudden when we really think about it and look at something, we might view it differently. Empathetic listening, we talked about again, feeling for, being sympathetic to. It's used in relationship tones. It better be genuine though, because people see through it, and if it's not, you'll be viewed as uncaring and selfish. They hold the keys to our relationship growing or being at least maintained. With each dialogue, people are either building a relationship or not. We have to have that commitment towards civility, even if we're frustrated with our partner. We have to be civil. We have to show them that we're listening and we're trying to understand their position, right? I mentioned truth and reconciliation in the slide. The book talks about it a little bit too. That process is about healing relationships. We're talking more about it in relationship communication, but it's how we preserve our relationships in moments of high stress and or someone said something we didn't want to hear. It's about the idea of forgiveness, healing, moving through a moment, right? And so I covered the ideas of listening. There are different styles of listening. People may be categorized in one of the following styles of listeners: people-oriented, action-oriented, content-oriented, and time-oriented listeners. Research shows that 40% of people have more than one preferred listening style. I can tell you what mine are. I'm a people-oriented, action-oriented communicator first. Then content and time-oriented in those orders. That's why I probably listed them out this way now that I think about it, because that's how I approach things. We don't consciously think about that, but yet this is how we act. Research shows that people still revert back to a single preferred style when they're in a high-stress situation or a very emotional situation, even though they know that blending those styles would be better for them. In that moment, we're kind of stuck. Emotion or stress has us, and we can't give more than one style of listening in that moment. People-oriented listeners are concerned about the needs and feelings of others and may get distracted from tasks because you're trying to address those feelings. Okay. Action-oriented listeners prefer well-organized, precise, and accurate information. They can become frustrated when they perceive communication to be unorganized or inconsistent. So meaning, I love to listen to people. But when I'm looking for information outside of that kind of communication, when I'm listening, I'm looking for information compiled in a precise, accurate manner so I can make my judgments, my perceptions, and move through. I don't want to listen to tons of content. I'm not an analytics person. And that said, I do analytics, but in my job, but I'm not Mr. Analytics. I don't want to see gobs of information. I think that was the hardest thing when I was going to school, reading hundreds of textbooks literally in 4 years, hundreds, and trying to learn these principles. Content was not my strong suit, but some people are content listeners. They're analytic. They enjoy listening and processing complex messages. They like the in-depth information. They like multiple sides of a topic. They like multiple perspectives. And I do like multiple sides, multiple perspectives at times, because it goes back to me listening to people in general and understanding their perspective. But content-oriented listeners, man, they're just in it for just give me as much information as you can, right? And then there's time-oriented listeners. Now, we're all time-oriented listeners at times because we're trying to complete tasks. We're trying to achieve goals, meaning get our schoolwork done, right? They don't listen or like information that could be perceived as irrelevant. They want base level, little tiny bites of information, okay? And they tend to cut people off and make quick decisions on if they have enough time or if they think they have enough information. Barriers to listening. They're present at every stage of the listening process. At the receiving stage, noise can block or distort incoming stimuli. At the interpreting stage, complex or abstract information may be difficult to relate to through our previous experience. Therefore, it makes it harder for us to understand, right? Recalling stage, natural limits to our memory and challenges to concentration can interfere. In evaluating stage, our personal biases and prejudice can cause us to block people out, their message out, because we assume that we know what they're going to say and we assume that we don't agree with it. At the responding stage, a lack of paraphrasing and questioning skills can lead to misunderstanding. In the following sections, we'll explore those factors, environmental and physical factors, or more, as well as the cognitive factors, the personal factors. And then we're going to talk about bad listening practices and how we can get better at it. Psychological noise, like environmental noise, it's there, right? We talked a little bit about it earlier. It could be noise stemming from a physical illness or injury, My knees are creaking something fierce. No, that was not my knees earlier that you heard creak, though. That was me adjusting in the chair to get a little bit closer to the microphone. I realized I'd started to drift away. Anyway, but my knees are creaky today. I hurt. It's cold. It's damp. And for those who are interested about trying to figure out when I recorded this message, we're about to have an ice storm. Yay! Aren't we lucky? I've stocked up the firewood for the wood-burning stove behind me. I'm good to go, really. But the point is, all of that's running through my brain as well, right? And all of that's creating noise. It's my thoughts, my hurt, my pain. We can try to block that as best we can, and at times we do a really good job, other times we don't. You know, we talked about a little bit about cognitive limits, meaning if we don't understand something, unless we paraphrase and or reinterpret that, right, we may not store that information away and we may be lost to us. We could be daydreaming. We could be multitasking. Because when we multitask, I don't doubt that you're a good multitasker. But I'll tell you this much, you're not listening and receiving as well as you could be if you were concentrating on the message. I like to do this as an exercise to try to help you understand how your brain works. Your listening mind is a wall of 10 television, and 5 of the televisions are tuned in to me right now. I'm your channel. But the other 5 are tuned into other things. They're tuned into, oh my gosh, what was that I heard in the background of the lecture? Oh my gosh, I'm hungry. Oh my gosh, I need to get some more. I've got a paper due soon. You know, there's so many things. Or maybe it's the noise of your children in the background. For those of you who don't have children, just understand someday you may have children and there will be noise. If you got 5 of those TVs tuned into me, you're probably doing okay. But you're still using half of your cognitive ability. That's what multitasking is like. So pay attention. When it's important, pay attention. And don't be too judgmental about when it's important or when it's not. I always assumed, I went into every lesson, every class, I was going to get something out of it. And I was listening to get something out of it. I was trying to block out all the other noise. I wouldn't respond to my wife's text. I would not do many things because I was in class. Another barrier comes from our ability to listen, and that people speak at a rate of 125 to 175 words per minute. I'm roughly in the 155, just so you know. I tend to slow it down a bit, but most of the time I'm around 150, 155. But we, as listeners, can process between 400 and 800 words per minute. So think about it. Our brain is apt to wander off because we could listen at a rate of 3 to 4 times, maybe even 5 times, what someone can deliver a message at. But if you use the tools like repeating, rephrasing, and even reorganizing messages, that will help you create more understanding, more meaning, and be a better listener. I mentioned this one earlier. Being self-centered and figuring out what we think we need to hear, or even having a lack of motivation, are huge barriers to our ability to listen. When our self-consciousness is raised, we may be thinking about, do I look okay? Is my hair okay? Oh my gosh, how am I sitting? Oh, I wore those old shoes today to class. I didn't mean to wear these shoes. I went and walked the dogs in these shoes, and then I meant to switch shoes, but I forgot to switch shoes. And all of that's interfering with the professor's message, right? How about this one? Oh my gosh. I think he or she is so cute, right? And we find ourselves immersed in how wonderful that person is, whether they're in the class or not in the class. And again, we're not listening fully. Remember, our brain actively employs selective attention getting methods, meaning grabbing information and attention if it gets our attention. Otherwise, we just kind of wander off with our brain, right? My phrase that I love to throw in there is, this will be on the exam, midterm, whatever, I might say it that way, and it gets your attention. And I have helped you because it is something that is going definitely be on there. Sometimes we're just not prepared to listen because we just aren't wanting to listen that day. Or we never even tried to be prepared to listen. We've got to go in with a mindset that I want to get something out of this. I want to learn something. I want to be better at this. I want to grow as an individual. I've taught communication classes for several years. I've consistently found that students and teachers that approach the listening part of the course less enthusiastic than other parts of the course. Listening is often viewed as an annoyance or a chore, or it's just ignored or minimized as part of the communication process. But in reality, listening is a huge part of the communication process, and it affects all the other elements of communication. Now, sometimes we're going to have bad speakers, or I'm going to stumble over a word, or you're going to stumble over a word, or whatever might happen, right? But it's up to us to kind of weed through that. I know I tend to run a little quicker sometimes, and I'll stumble over a word because I'm trying to go so fast. Because there's a lot of material to cover. And I'm that type of professor that even if I had you in a classroom, I know where my limits are as far as a class, and I'm trying to keep those lessons under what a normal class period would be, right? So I'm trying to cover a lot of material, but not make it in such a way that you can't understand it. But I admit that some of these chapters are long, and we cover a lot of information, and it might be lost, right? And if it ever is, please ask me questions. Let's go back through and let's create a true communication that you're getting what you need. Prejudice. We believe a certain way. We engage in prejudicial listening because we're trying to preserve our ways of thinking and avoid being convinced of something different. That's simply why we do that. Okay? And there are many ways that we can be prejudiced, and we do, unfortunately, sometimes practice this. All of us do. And I don't mean prejudice as in race. Oscar Wilde said it best. Listening is a dangerous thing. If one listens, one might be convinced. We don't generally want to change our mind about things. We want to go through life in a predictable manner that we like. Sorry. Same slide. Second time. When we think about the previously discussed barriers to effective listening and how difficult they might be able to overcome, it's true, but they are still within, at least partially, our control. Physical barriers, cognitive limitation, perceptual bias exist within all of us, and it's realistic to believe that we can be more conscious of them, thereby lessening them if we choose to, right? Might even be able to eliminate them altogether. Some bad listening practices are habitual, but they can be addressed with concerted effort. I am bad about interrupting. When I'm forced into a time situation, I'm an interrupter. I don't mean to be, but I'll try to say, I think what you're saying is this, therefore interrupting them before they may have gotten their total message out. And in that moment, I'm not normally a time-oriented communicator, but when time is of the essence, I find myself doing that, And I need to lay back and just let people tell me what they're feeling, seeing, doing. And even if I already know where this conversation is going, it's important for that conversation to take place and to be completed in a meaningful way. I'm not narcissistic listening because it's not about me. And I'm not pseudo-listening. Pseudo-listening meaning, when we think about pseudo-listening, meaning fake listening, right? Also, there's aggressive listening. When you're listening to someone, and attorneys do this all the time, to try to trap them in their words and try to get them on a technicality or something of that nature, right? So think about it. There are lots of ways we can sometimes be poor listeners without really thinking about it. Interrupting, I told you about that one. I'm guilty of it. Distorted listening is when we hear the story, hear the idea or information, but we get it wrong. We weren't remembering the order of events, or we weren't remembering exactly how something goes. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I still remember that. Okay? Because I learned it in such a way that I remember it, but I actually have to say it all out when asked a trivia question or something along that line where I need that information to get to that piece. Where is that at? Sometimes we're rationalizers. We use rationalization, and it's a distorted listening scheme that we apply, where we'll adapt, edit, or skew information to fit our own agenda or schemata. A great example of this is when I've been, in the past, explaining why someone earned a poor grade on something, and the student could reattribute the causes. They didn't follow the paper guidelines, which is what I said, and then turn it into, well, the professor's just a jerk or an unfair grader, right? But in reality, we've got, we covered it, as a teacher. It was listed in the syllabus, all of these things, and if you have questions, you always ask, right? But sometimes we as people don't want to be the problem. Is that fair? Distorted listening. I just like it. I've seen teachers go the other way. By the way, I could tell you situations about that. Eavesdropping, we've covered that. Distorted listening. Eavesdropping is when we're listening in for at precise moments of a conversation to hear gossip or dirt, right? Let's not do that. Just don't, okay? Please don't. It's not great. It's not good in a workplace. Half of my wife's trouble at her workplace is caused by eavesdropping and people being aggressive listeners. An aggressive listener is where people pay attention to what you're saying in order to attack something that you say, or attack you as an individual. Please don't be that person unless you're going to be an attorney, and even then, make sure you keep it to your workplace. Now, people do that because of their own sense of low self-esteem or insecurities, but the reality is it's kind of that bullying mentality, right? We've all probably experienced it. There's a lot of that going on at a high level in our government right now. The point is, there are ways to communicate and still get your point across without bullying people or belittling them. Please don't do that. If you think it's going to get you ahead in life, it's only going to get you ahead in life if you got tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And even then, it's only going to get you so far, because ultimately people will not like you. And that's unfortunate. And we can not be aggressive listeners and not attack people with our communication. Narcissistic listening, again, remember I said self-centered, self-absorbed earlier. What they're doing is they're using these opportunities to listen and then turn the conversation back around to them. Sometimes it's called one-upping, sometimes, or it's just they fool themselves into thinking that they're listening and being active contributors in conversation, but in reality, they're really trying to bring it back to the attention back to them. It's unfortunate. It's just part of who they are as people. I don't know what to say there. As you can tell, when I start to think about this deeper, it affects me. So let's just say that I've had clients and parents that have been narcissistic people in general, and in that, surviving those moments is difficult, and ultimately most of us choose to not communicate with people of that persuasion. Pseudo listening, remember, we're listening but we're really not listening. The act of listening, we're pretending. I hear you, the phrase I hear you, that says you did hear them, the voice waves hit your eardrums, but you're not actively listening to them. Let's talk about listening competence in each stage of the process, because we're already at 15 minutes, almost 51 minutes. We can develop competence within each stage of the listening process. That's what Ridge, who wrote the book on listening, said. Sorry, I'm still feeling, my throat's still a little scratchy. Give me 1 second. To improve listening at the receiving stage, you have to prepare yourself to listen. Remember I told you that earlier? And discern between intentional messages and just noise or unintentional delivery issues. Need to concentrate on the stimuli most relevant to your listening purpose or goals. Be mindful of the selection and attention process as much as possible, meaning pay attention. Look for turn-taking signals so that we follow the conversational flow. Avoid interrupting someone when they're speaking in order to maintain your ability to receive stimuli and listen from them. To improve the listening competence in the interpreting stage, identify the main points and supporting points of someone's talk, right? Use contextual clues from another person or previous experience or environment to discern additional meaning. We want to be aware of how relational, cultural, and situational context can influence meaning. We'll talk more about that when we study culture. Be aware of the different meanings of silence. Silence is powerful, by the way. And note differences in tone and voice, as well as other paralinguistic clues that may influence meaning. To improve listening at the recall stage, use multiple sensory channels to decode messages and make complete memories. Repeat, rephrase, and reorganize information to fit the cognitive preferences, and that will in turn help you remember. Use mnemonic devices as a gimmick to help with recall. You heard me do kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. 1492, Columbus sailed across the ocean blue, right? Lots of tools we can use to help remember things for a long period of time. To improve listening at the evaluation stage, separate facts from influences and personal judgments. Be familiar with and able to identify persuasive strategies, as well as fallacies of reasoning. Assess the credibility of the speaker and the message. And lastly, be aware of your own biases and how your perception filters can create barriers to effective listening. To improve listening at the responding stage, ask clarifying and follow-up questions. Paraphrase the information to check understanding. Give feedback that is relevant to the speaker's purpose or motivation for speaking. And adapt your response to the speaker and the context of the topic, right? Do not let the preparation and rehearsal of your response diminish earlier stages of your listening. Meaning, don't be so full of yourself in that moment of saying, oh, I asked you a good follow-up question, to forget to hear the answer of the speaker to your follow-up question. Active listening refers to the process of pairing outwardly visible positive listening behaviors with positive cognitive, and listening practices. We need to be active listeners. Active listening can help address many of the environmental, physical, cognitive, and personal barriers to effective listening that we discussed earlier. Behaviors associated with active listening can enhance informational, critical, and empathetic listening. So, being an active listener starts before the speaker ever starts speaking. Active listeners make strategic choices and take action in order to set up ideal listening conditions. Physical, environmental noises can be managed by changing locations, right? Manipulating the lighting, the temperature, or furniture. When possible, avoid important listening activities during times of distracting psychological or physiological noise, meaning when you're hungry. In terms of cognitive barriers to effective listening, we can prime ourselves to listen by analyzing a listening situation before it ever begins. You can ask yourself, what are the goals? What are my goals for listening to this message? How does this message relate to me and my life? What listening type and style are most appropriate for this message? 3 possibilities to overcome barriers with effective listening. 3 possibilities for internal dialogue include covert coaching, self-reinforcement, and covert questioning. Covert coaching involves sending yourself messages containing advice about better listening, such as you're getting distracted right now. You're focusing on things you have to do after work. Just focus on what this conversation is about right now. Self-reinforcement involves sending yourself affirmatives and positive messages. You're being such a good active listener right now. That will help you do well in this class. When we think about covert questioning, this involves asking yourself questions about the content in ways that focus your attention and reinforce the material, meaning you'll retain it in your memory. What's the main idea from that PowerPoint slide? Why is he always talking about his brother in front of our neighbors? People do things for a reason. Trying to figure out what that reason is helps us remember the whole. I just covered this one. I don't know why there's a duplicate. I'm sorry. Active listening can overcome barriers to effective listening. Mental bracketing refers to the process of intentionally separating out intrusive or irrelevant thoughts that may distract you from listening. This requires that we monitor our concentration and attention and be prepared to let thoughts that aren't related to the speaker's message pass through our minds without giving them much attention. Talked a little bit about mnemonic devices. Again, they help us in recall. 3 main mnemonic devices are acronyms, rhymes, visualization. Acronyms, Holmes. That's how I remembered the Great Lakes. Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Think about this. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. That's how we remember how to work many devices, right? And visualization. If you imagine seeing a glass of port wine, that's a red wine, and the red navigation light on a boat, it'll help you remember that the red light on the boat is always on the port side. The blue light on a boat is always on the starboard side. That helps people with navigation at night. I told you I'm pretty good at trivia. Stuff I remember. I don't understand it either exactly, but it sticks. When we think about active listening behaviors, from those suggestions that we previously discussed, you can start to see there are ways that you can be better at active listening. We all can engage in active listening behaviors as we receive any number of messages throughout the day, right? Think about eye contact. It's a key sign of active listening. Even the speakers look at eye contact as a signal of attentiveness. Lack of eye contact may show inattentiveness. And then other ways of active listening is to reference previous statements made by the speaker, and ask probing questions, of course. Distinguishing among facts and evaluating credibility of supporting materials are critical listening skills, which require good informational and good listening skills. So we're not good at being a critical listener just at birth. We grow into this. When we think about formal speaking situations, speakers may cite published items or publicly accessed sources to support their messages. You see me in the lectures doing this quite a bit. We do this to show credibility and help you evaluate our credibility. Sometimes we need to check ourselves. Our own biases and prejudices come into a conversation way before we ever get there to listen. Those are within us, and we need to look at those and try to figure out the whys of them, and then get rid of them if they're not applicable to everyday life. Because let me tell you something, I go in, even students teach me things. I listen because I'm always learning and I want to keep learning. So don't ever let yourself be ruled by preconceived notions of your past. And always, always, always think beyond the message. What is being said and what's not being said? When I evaluate politicians speak, oh my gosh, I'm always doing that. Whose interests are being served with their communication, right? And ideas. Where are these voices and ideas coming from? Who's being included and excluded in these ideas in this communication? Be aware that speakers do intentionally or unintentionally slant, edit, twist messages to make them fit particular perspectives or for their own personal gain. So I typically ask myself, what are the speaker's goals? When we think about empathetic listening, it's huge in our life, especially in personal situations. A prominent scholar of empathetic listening describes it this way. Empathetic listening is to be respectful of the dignity of others. It's caring, a love of the wisdom that's found within others, whoever they may be. Bruno literally wrote the book on communication years ago. And I love that quote because, I paraphrased it of course, but I love the idea because people have unique experience and gifts that they can give you if you're willing to listen. Alright? Yeah, we have to be open to subjectivity. And we actually have to be engaged to think it might be worthwhile, right? But the goal of that is, so many people could teach us so much. And to be a better empathic listener, we need to suspend or suppress our judgment of the other person or their message. Paraphrasing is an important part of empathetic listening because it helps us put the other person's words into our frame of experience without making it about us. In addition, speaking the words of someone else in our own way can help evoke within us the feelings that the person who might be experiencing who said them. Sorry about that. We can engage in mirroring as well, which is referring to a listener's replication of the nonverbal signals. And we're going to cover that more in nonverbal. But mirroring, if I notice someone's leaning in, I might tend to lean in at the table as well, right? In hospital, my wife sometimes will adopt her posture and tone to meet what the patient is sending them, or she might adjust the tone to if they're being mean. And let's be real, if we're in pain, we might be a little bit more direct with our communication. So she will sometimes change her tone to project empathy, right? To project sympathy and empathy. So even in nursing, even in other fields, we can utilize great communication skills to make ourselves excel at our job. Active, critical, and empathetic listening skills can be helpful in a variety of contexts. We kind of talked about that earlier. Understanding the role that listening plays within professional, relation, and cultural and gendered contexts can also help us, all right? So let's think about that. Listening in professional contexts. Listening and organizational communication scholars note that listening is the most neglected aspect of organizational communication research. Empathetic listening and active listening can play key roles in organizational communication. Managers are wise to enhance their empathetic listening skills. Being able to empathize with employees creates a positive communication climate. Next thing you know, your employees might stay there longer because they feel like they're being heard. Even if changes aren't happening within the company, at least they feel that they're being heard. Active listening within organizational members also promotes involvement, increases motivation, which leads to cohesion and helps enhance the communication climate. Ultimately, when we think about active listening, it helps us achieve goals. We talked about that earlier. In an organization, it's a perfect example of how we might achieve those goals. Organizational scholars have determined various communication climates specific to listening. Listening environment refers to characteristics and norms of an organization and its members that contribute to expectations and perceptions about listening. Positive listening environments are perceived to be more employee-centered, which improve job satisfaction and cohesion, meaning retention of employees. But how can we create such environments? I want you to think about that. We've all done some work, and we've all worked for a place that we were either heard or not heard. How can we create better work environments through listening? Within relational context, some of this I've already covered, plays a central role in establishing and maintaining our relationships. Without listening competence, we wouldn't be able to engage in the self-disclosure process, and we'll talk more about that in relationship communication. But that's essential for the establishment of relationships. Newly acquainted people get to know each other through increasingly personal and reciprocal disclosures of personal information. In order to reciprocate a conversational partner's disclosure, we have to process it through listening. And once relationships are formed, listening to others provides a psychological reward through a simple act of recognition. And that, in turn, helps us maintain our relationships. Listening to our relational partners and being listened to in return is part of the give and take of any interpersonal relationship. Something as routine and pointless as listening to our romantic partner debrief the events of his or her day. Right? They're important. It shows that we put our own needs to the side and we concern ourselves about their needs. A little bit about culture. We need to cover this because, it's an important part of it as well. When we think about listening and culture, some cultures place more importance on listening. A low context communication style is one that much more of the meaning is generated through interaction from verbal communication rather than nonverbal or contextual clues. U.S. Americans of European descent generally use low context communication style, but people from East Asia and Latin cultures tend to use a high context communication style. So if low context is one where we're concentrating from the verbal communication, you can imagine high context means that they're thinking about the nonverbals. They're thinking about what might not be said. When we think about cultures with a high context orientation, they'll use less verbal communication and value silence because it is powerful. Their words, they will choose more carefully and will carry more meaning, generally speaking. So, culture plays a role. Gender also plays a role. Most recent research shows that people communicate in ways to confirm, honestly, some gender stereotypes, and yet sometimes not confirm those stereotypes, right? Most of our communication is influenced through societal expectations that are innate or gendered hardwiring. Think about this. Men are generally discouraged from expressing emotions in a public setting, right? But women sharing an emotional experience with a man may perceive the man's lack of an emotional reaction as an inattentiveness. However, he's just going by what he knows. He's listening, but he withholds his nonverbal expressions because of societal norms, meaning I'm not allowed to show emotion. He's probably not even going to realize he's doing this. It may make him seem like a lack of an empathetic listener or active listener, but in reality, he may just be following his cues. So therefore, we need to create listenable messages. They're orally delivered messages that are tailored to be comprehended by a listener, and that will be on the, probably more than likely, will be on the midterm. Sorry, it's not in bold. When we think about processing written communication, it's different than the way we process orally delivered language, like a speech. When we think about writing something written like an essay versus speaking it out loud, generally the way we're handling it and the way we're bringing it to our audience is going to be different too. Even the language we use might be slightly different. Sometimes this creates a problem for us not knowing where we're going next necessarily, or how to get to that spot next, because sometimes we're not spending enough time taking the data, the information, and turning it into something that is going to be spoken orally. Now, you've seen me, and I'm guilty so much of this, unfortunately. This is one of my tragic flaws. And I'm not saying that jokingly, like, really it is. But I tend to go faster, and like right now is a perfect example. We're at an hour and almost 13 minutes. Trying to get this done in an hour and 30 minutes because that's a class setting. So sometimes I get moving so fast, I'll stumble over or mispronounce words. Have that verbal trip up. Or in Unit 1 and 2, where I was feeling severely under the weather. You guys had probably no idea how badly I was doing. I was having to stop and recollect my thoughts because my mental capacity was less. Because I was feeling poorly. Imagine that. I had a lot of noise going on that I was trying to mask and cover up and not allowed to overwhelm our lecture. One more thing that I dislike about online courses, which I'm sure I've covered at least once, but this is at least the second time in this course, trying to cover that so much information in a class timeline. We're doing this to make it easy for our students, but in reality, sometimes it can get in the way of our students. That's why I suggest you break down these lectures into segments that you can understand and in time frames that you can process. Whether it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Take yourself some notes and then jump back in and cover the next 20 or 30 minutes. Make yourself some notes and then finish the lesson. By doing it that way, you'll retain more information. Most students will retain more information. Don't like to make total generalizations. When we're creating listenable messages, we need to use shorter, actively worded sentences. Use personal pronouns, I want to show you, or let me tell you about. Use lists or organization constructs like problem solution, pro and con, compare, contrast, or even bullet points. Every now and then you'll watch me do bullet points, like right now. Use transition and other markers that help a listener navigate your message. Time markers like today, first, second, and third, show order, right? Previews, like 2 things I'd like to say about that, so you know that point 1's coming, then point 2. And reviews. So basically, we go through, basically, like, creating a listenable message is completely in our control. We need to break down into shorter, actively worded sentences, use the personal pronouns, use the organizational constructs like bullet points, pro-con, problem solution, things like that, and again, make examples relevant to you and or your listeners' actual experience. I tell you the stories about me and my wife, or me and something else, to make it relevant to you. Not because I need to go into storytelling hour. I can do that somewhere else. I've got plenty of time to do that. Sometimes it requires, when we're listening to someone, to give formal feedback. All right? Be specific about what you're seeing. Some students write things like eye contact when they grade a peer about a speech or something, right? But eye contact isn't positive or negative. A comment like good eye contact or not enough eye contact tells the speaker what they need to do better, right? Be descriptive, right? Explain. Not enough eye contact. In sections of your speech, it looked like you read your speech for the first 30 seconds of your speech, or towards the middle of your speech, you relied heavily on your notes and you couldn't make eye contact with your audience, right? And be positive. Don't make comments like stop fidgeting or stop saying or get more sources by. You can say those. So if you could be less active with your hands, if you could get more sources, if you could find more sources to back up a specific point in their speech, that's more helpful, right? Stop saying and We can say that, but then we need to follow it up. Instead, use pauses to regain your thought and move to and then a transition word to move to your next idea. That'll stop people from having hurt feelings. Be constructive. Tell them when they do a good job, and be realistic. Because no one's perfect at speaking. I can't even be perfect. You hear it on a regular basis. Now, I can dial it up as I need to and dial it down. But in lecture, I do try to, I'm going to be formal enough, but I don't want it to be so formal that you see me being perfect and then you think, oh my gosh, I'll never be perfect. All right? So, compliments help. And avoid defensiveness. Avoid creating a situation of defensiveness and or hurt feelings, okay? When you give yourself feedback, remember it's not all or nothing. Remember that most of what we do in this class and in our other public speaking class even, this is about learning. I don't expect anyone to be perfect, and the grading points aren't set up to be perfect in these things, right? I had a student tell me one time that he thought his face looked red. I never noticed that in his speech. He said his blood pressure was up and his face looked red. I didn't think that was a big deal, and honestly, it didn't amount to much of anything, meaning we as speakers sometimes are so focused on things that are outside our control and or meaningless, and get ourselves so worked up that we can create a negative experience in the other aspects of communicating, right? So, again, set goals. Again, listen. Be a good listener. All right? So let's talk about homework. This week I want you to keep a listening log for at least part of one day. Note times when you feel like you're exhibiting competent listening behaviors, and note times when listening's becoming a challenge, right? Analyze the log on what you've learned in this section. Which positive listening skills help you listen better? What strategy could you apply to your listening challenges to improve your overall listening competence? And that is it for Chapter 5. Great work, guys. I'm trying to keep from saying guys. I do not mean guys in a gender-specific way, and I'm going to get better at that. So I hope you all are doing well. Email me with any questions, and we'll cover Chapter 6 next.